So there's this notion that because Russia on paper has a more powerful military with a larger population, a larger GDP, as well as nuclear weapons, that all is lost for Ukraine. That there's nothing the Ukrainians can do, so any assistance that we are providing them is futile, and we should just let Russia take Ukraine. The fact that such an attitude runs completely counter to US values pertaining to national sovereignty, freedom, self determination, etc., aside, here's why such thinking is actually foolish. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and took Kabul in 48 hours. The Soviets had air superiority and overwhelming force on the battlefield, but they went on to lose that war 10 years later in 1989. The Soviets had nuclear weapons at that time, and yet no nuclear exchange happened, and World War III did not start despite the fact that Russia clearly lost that war with the US assisting the Afghan Mujahideen, and the Soviets knew the US were assisting them. In 1979, China invaded Vietnam. China was a nuclear power at that time, having detonated their first nuclear weapon 10 years earlier. The Chinese withdrew after a month of heavy casualties. One thing I also often hear is that given Russia's population versus the population of Ukraine, even if Ukraine maintains its 3 or 4 to 1 casualty ratio over Russia, Russia will still overcome and be the victor. Well, my argument to that is during Vietnam, the US had a 10 to 1 casualty ratio over the Viet Cong. The Americans fled that country after 8 years despite being a nuclear power, and no nukes were used there either. Keeping with the United States, 20 years after the US launched its war into Afghanistan, the Americans left. And the Taliban is still in power. The point here is that it's more than just raw numbers. Yes, killing more of the enemy than they kill you usually wins most wars, and that's been traditionally the case up through World War II. But more importantly, today, there are other facets. There is the economics of warfare, the political will, the domestic support, the international aid, and a myriad of other things. The US military is the most powerful and efficient killing machine in the history of the world. Despite winning the vast majority of battles in all of the wars they have fought, the US still loses wars. Not because of the military aspects, but because of the other things I spoke about. History is littered with examples of more powerful countries fleeing weaker countries, and that includes all three major nuclear powers. All three have lost to a military or to a group that on paper was definitely inferior to them. Now, one of the counters I get when I make this argument is that, well, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is different. They're right next to each other, and Russia's logistics lines are closer. Well, setting aside the fact that China actually borders Vietnam as well as the USSR bordered Afghanistan during their invasions, I would have to say that, yeah, I agree. This situation is different. Ukraine has a well-trained westernized military with modern Western equipment. Meanwhile, the rest of those countries where the US, China, the Russians all lost, they generally lost to what amounts to an insurgency. We haven't even gotten to the insurgency portion of this fight in Ukraine. Russia is still dealing with their regular military and struggling. In all of those other cases, the regular military was defeated relatively quickly. So yeah, this is different. Russia is struggling with a regular military force, and outside of China, when it comes to potentially Vietnam, there's no previous example of this existing, not even in the Soviet space. As I said, they dominated Afghanistan. So with all that in mind, understand this. Ukraine is far from decided at this point, and Russia is nowhere close to victory. You have to understand, all of these wars that I spoke about, with the exception of the Vietnam-China War, all of these wars lasted 8 to 20 years. And as terrible as that sounds, we are unfortunately only in year 3 of this war, so to expect that Ukraine should have won by now is quite foolish. As I've said before, the cracks in Russia's ability to prosecute this war in Ukraine are forming. We just need to keep driving wedge after wedge into those cracks, and eventually the whole facade will crumble.